Welcome to the Trashy Bus! Trashy, 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 trashy. Welcome to the Trashy
Oh yeah, that's Trashy, a podcast from Office Supply Publishing and Classic Gunpoint. I'm your host, Chris Garcia. It was 1987 and I was 12, and I had access to a number of computers. I had an Atari 2600, technically a computer. I had an Apple II, but at school, Westwood Elementary School, we had one of the early IBM PC clones. And one of the kids brought in a disc that had a game on it. And you could tell it was not legit because it was on a completely blank disc. It had probably been copied at some point. That game was Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards. And it was pretty much the definition of trashy when it came to computer games. Now, there have been sexually based games as long as there have been electronic games. Some have been of questionable taste. Some have been of extremely bad taste. Custer's Revenge is the one that comes up as one of the early arcade games that was just wrong. But Leisure Suit Larry was an interesting case because it wasn't just something someone had developed and was passing around. Sierra Online built it. And this is a company that was huge at the time. King's Quest, Police Quest, all those Quest games. That was its bread and butter. But it's releasing Leisure Suit Larry. Now, we have to go back, because the designer was a guy named Lowe. And he was a programmer, and he started to go into the writing and design aspect of the games, which isn't always a good idea. It's usually a better idea to let programmers be programmers and writers be writers. There are exceptions, but I maintain there shouldn't be. Now, he wasn't setting out to make a porn game. He was actually adapting an older text adventure game called Soft Porn Adventure. And it was crude, it was quaint. I've played it a few times. It's nothing super hardcore. But what Lowe had done was he created a character, Larry Laffer. And this is hilarious, actually. If you played the game right, Leisure Suit Larry Laffer, was constantly punished. And it's hilarious. It's showing you that bad behavior is bad and you get knocked down for it. The humor in the game, and it was a funny game, came from the fact that even if you played it perfectly, you kept getting knocked down. But you'd get up again. Now, there were questions internally whether or not they should release it. And they did. Largely because, one, like with the old Hollywood code, the bad guys always got their comeuppance. And two, they knew controversy sold. And this was going to be a controversial game. And it arrived immediately. Retailers didn't know what to do with the games. A lot of them refused to carry it. I think Egghead Software, one of the big companies at that point, refused to carry it. I seem to remember seeing it at the Bite Shop when I was a kid. Might have been Electronic Boutique. I can't remember quite, but it was in the same area. Growing up in Silicon Valley, you sort of tie pieces of technology with specific sites. And for me, you had the Bite Shop, you had Electronic Boutique, you had Egghead Software, you had Fry's a little later. And you had sort of mom and pop computer shops. There are very few of them left today, but there's still a couple. There's actually one in Boulder Creek still. Now, the interesting thing is, at this point, there is absolutely no rating system for games. That would come about almost 10 years later. Now, what's interesting is Sierra thought that this might be a problem. So they had an age verification quiz at the beginning to sort of, it would ask questions about history, politics, pop culture type stuff that only adults should know. And yeah, that was supposed to be a guardrail, but it didn't really work because kids would just look around. Now, what's really funny here is how predictive it was of the future. Because Leisure Suit Larry wasn't funny for adults. It wasn't supposed to be. It was funny for teenagers. It was more or less observational humor for the lonely, sexually frustrated set. And Larry wasn't a hero. He was broke. He dressed terribly. He was humiliated constantly. The women in it were actually presented with a lot more sharpness than Larry ever was. And usually, all the women in it were completely dismissive and antagonistic towards Larry. And it's hilarious because, you died all the time. It was sudden, it was ridiculous, it was great. And it wasn't an empowerment fantasy. That's the strange thing. But at the same time, it wasn't a there before the grace of God go I. Now, of course, once parents started to see what was going on, and usually, not always, Dad would buy it for the computer, because computers' use for kids wasn't as prevalent as it was for adults. Asterisk, I grew up in Silicon Valley. Of course it was more prevalent for kids. But one of the kids one day would finally get to play Leisure Suit Larry. They'd figure out how to do it. And that was that. This was doing stuff that we were seeing, basically the incel humor wave of the early 2010s very much echoes what was being done in Leisure Suit Larry. But the game was a hit. Adult content in games absolutely exploded after Leisure Suit Larry. And you have to remember some of the things that were also hits around that time. Again, King's Quest was one. Absolutely a great, huge deal. But there were games like Space Eggs. Like, at that point, a lot of the most successful games were still sort of the smaller things that have been around forever. Lemonade Stand was big. I used to play it all the time. You had all the Infocom games. That's the thing is, Leisure Suit Larry had graphics. They weren't great, but they were graphics. There were absolutely graphic games at that point. You had things like Seven Cities of Gold, one of my personal favorites. But Leisure Suit Larry was a different level. And of course, those graphics were dirty. As always happens when controversy breeds success, it became a franchise. And the first sequel was actually released about a year later. And the sequel was called Leisure Suit Larry Goes Looking for Love in Several Wrong Places. Now, he had been originally in the town of Lost Wages and sort of went to various different locations. Cruise ships, tropical resorts, like places like that. And one of the things about this version is the humor got a little broader. And there was less sort of emphasis on the consequence and failure thing. It was just, just making boob and dick jokes. And there were a lot of recycling as well. What are you going to do? That's the one that sort of got bigger, partly because of the greater availability of PCs by that point. And you have to remember, there's always a push-pull. The capabilities of the computer drive what you can do. And the desire to be able to do more with your computer drives the demand for new sound cards, audio cards, all of it. Now, the third version, Leisure Suit Larry 3, Passionate Patty in Pursuit of the Pulsating Pectorals, sort of flipped things. You could control a female character, Passionate Patty, for extended periods of the game. It wasn't all Leisure Suit Larry, but he was still there. In a way, he was Mario in this sort of very small pond, which is great when you can have a character in it that is identifiable, but then also have the world built out enough that you can add new characters and it doesn't completely water it down. That's cool. Of course, the jokes that it were telling were still highly sophomoric and usually, I wouldn't say anti-women, but it's definitely a thread there. very much objectifying women. And they thought that maybe giving a woman as a playable character would lessen that. It didn't really. It also just wasn't as good a game. Now, what's hilarious is that there was supposed to be a fourth game, or maybe there wasn't. It was called Leisure Suit Larry 4: The Missing Floppies, and it was referenced because when Leisure Suit Larry 5 came out, Passionate Patty does a little undercover work, which was less than a year, I think, after the third one came out. It was clearly that sort of referential humor. It was actually becoming more meta. And a lot of games did this. The kings of that, I think, were Infocom. All their text-based adventure games did something like that. But at this time, you also have companies like LucasArts that are releasing more and more of these graphic games that are doing pretty well. Now, what's interesting, again, this is where the push-pull comes out. The graphics were getting better, and the interface was great. But everyone was sort of criticizing it's the same old jokes, it's the same old concept. And so in 93, Leisure Suit Larry 6, Shape Up or Slip Out, had great graphics. Hand-drawn VGA graphics. But again, diminishing returns. The series was prettier, but it was still doing the same jokes. It hadn't evolved that aspect. And by the time the sixth game, Leisure Suit Larry 7, Love for Sale, that came out in 96, the market was just completely different. CD-ROMs were out. Voice cutscenes and so forth. Sexual content wasn't really that rare. And they really sort of leaned into the sort of the cartooniness of it, which is good. You could really make that work, but it was just not the type of game that was selling anymore. At this thing, you had things like Dark Forces. I think the first X-Wing game was already out. You had all sorts of things from LucasArts that were doing huge business. Not to mention you had Doom. The game world was changing. Now, of course, Leisure Suit Larry lost its ability to be shocking once we had the internet and porn was in everyone's house, on everyone's computer. And they tried to revive the character at least, I think, 2 or 3 times. They re-released all the original games on CD. I remember that. In the 2000s, they released Leisure Suit Larry, Magna Cum Laude, and that was 2004. And it was just a set of dumb mini-games. I don't remember playing that one, but I do remember seeing it. Now, of course, Leisure Suit Larry actually started debates about what was appropriate for software and how do we make sure access happens to the right kids. And it was in 94 that the Entertainment Software Rating Board, ESRB, was formed largely in response to Mortal Kombat and Doom. Not entirely, but that was definitely a part of it. And there were other games too, like Night Trap, for example. Narc also often got mentioned. But you would hear mentions of Leisure Suit Larry as, we need to prevent kids from getting a hold of this. I was one of the kids that was getting a hold of this. Did it warp my mind? Probably a little. But I also knew what I was interacting with wasn't the real world. This is something that everyone misses. Kids know. They know that this is not the real world. This is not how things go. Now, we have, Warcraft and things in recent years that have blurred that line. But just like with Dungeons and Dragons in the 70s, we know what is real and we know what is game and we know what is appropriate to a degree. That is an argument for a different, more serious podcast. Really, Leisure Suit Larry is just sort of a curiosity of a certain time. Al Lowe has said that it was of its moment, and that trying to wring it out long term is probably a bad idea. But he wouldn't complain because, hey, money. Once general smut became available on the internet, Leisure Suit Larry just sort of fell out of fashion, and it's never really come back. Does it... And I played one recently. I played the original again. Does it entertain? And I think it does. Does it titillate? Maybe a little. But is it fun? And I have to say it is. In many ways, it is like watching 1980s stand-up comedy. You know that this is not acceptable, I guess, in today's society. That doesn't make the delivery any less entertaining. But yeah, Leisure Suit Larry, absolutely trashy. I think it was trashy and yet at the same time kind of wonderful. It was very much of its moment. And to watch the evolution from 87 to 96 really is the sort of the space you want to look at. You can see how video games evolved. And that's cool. Or maybe it's just cool to a guy who was a video game historian for 20 years. I don't know. But there is no question, Leisure Suit Larry was trashy. So what's up next? Well, I've been thinking about a couple of different areas I want to go into, and I really want to look at trashy films. And when I think of trashy films, the first one I think of is John Waters, but that is a massive story that I'm going to wait on. But the second one is a trashy film that deserves so much talking about. Because as a kid growing up, I loved it. And pretty much every teen goes through a phase of loving it. That, of course, is the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So I hope you stay tuned. Because if you hate yourself for loving it, it's probably trashy.
Welcome to the Trashy.